Love One Another, Becoming the Church Jesus Longs For, by Gerald L. Sittser. Chapter 3. Be subject to one another. Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ, Ephesians 5:21. Linda and I used to watch old movies on public television. It gave us a chance to take in classic entertainment and to enjoy the performances of great actors and actresses, many of whom have long since died. Over the years, we saw several movies starring Fred Astaire, who appeared in dozens of films over a span of 4 decades. We never tired of his films, despite the predictable plots and the mediocre acting. It was Astaire's dancing that astonished us. He was a master on the dance floor, the embodiment of grace, effortlessness, and sophistication. He looked at home in tails and a top hat. After his death, Ginger Rogers, Astaire's famous dancing partner, was interviewed on Nightline. Ted Koppel invited her to reminisce about Astaire's career and her experience as his dancing partner. It was obvious that she relished the opportunity to reflect on their magical years together. He was so good, she said, that he never seemed to be leading and she following. The film clips proved her point. There was a fluidity between the two of them, a seamlessness and elegance, as if two people were dancing as one. Dancing in a broken world. Astaire and Rogers manifested in dance what God wants all of us to experience in life. He intends human relationships to be healthy, harmonious, and whole, so that regardless of the positions we occupy in the social order, we will not be aware of who's leading and who is following, who has the most power and who has the least. God wills that human relationships exhibit the same kind of seamlessness that Astaire and Rogers demonstrated on the dance floor. Of course, what God intends and what we experience are different, very different. It is often the case that instead of oneness, we experience disunity, instead of wholeness, brokenness. In a human society, which of course includes the church, we spend most of our time not dancing gracefully, but tripping over each other's feet. Rarely do we find human relationships that do not have conflict and do not cause hurt. I work in an academic institution, and I witness conflict so often that I marvel when I hear about normal, healthy relationships in departments. A friend recently reminded me that conflict can serve as a prelude to harmony. I agree with him too, but I wish I saw more examples of harmony to reassure me that he is indeed right. Mutual subjection is God's way of nurturing harmony in a discordant world, unity in broken relationships, healing in a sick society, and love in a divided church. It is applicable to imperfect people, like you and me, who belong to imperfect families, work in perfect jobs, participate in imperfect organizations, belong to imperfect churches, and live in an imperfect world. It shows us how to function in communities that have tension and conflict running through them. It addresses people who are not married to the ideal spouse, who are not parents of ideal children, who are not members of ideal churches, and who do not have ideal jobs, colleagues, or bosses. Mutual subjection takes the world as it is, not as we would expect it to be. It requires us to surrender ourselves to God, discerning how we can do His will in circumstances that are less than ideal. This is the one mutuality command that addresses life in the social order, which is a necessary reality. All of us belong to and play certain roles within society. For example, over the past few years, I have functioned as a son, brother, father, professor, coach, chaplain, board member, volunteer, administrator, committee chair, citizen, and leader. As a professor, I deal every day with students, colleagues, administrators, and secretaries. As a church member, I interact regularly with pastors, elders, youth leaders, Sunday school teachers, committee members, and the like. These roles are defined by the institutions to which I belong. Not every institution runs smoothly. Not every person is pleasant to work with or does his or her job well. Not every task is meaningful and fulfilling. Mutual subjection provides guidelines for how to function with good cheer and responsible behavior in a social order that does not always run smoothly. Ordering our understanding of subjection. Of all the mutuality commands, this one is perhaps the most difficult to understand and obey because it runs so contrary to modern values. Americans insist on defending their personal rights and securing or maintaining their social privileges, which makes the idea of subjection both foreign to our thinking and offensive in our cultural sensibilities. It appears to reinforce the power of those who already have too much and keep the powerless in a place of subordination. Marxists argue that the biblical notion of subjection is a classic illustration of how Christianity supports the unjust social order and prevents the powerless from recognizing their servile status developing a sense of class consciousness and overthrowing the party or people in power. They conclude that Christianity is inherently conservative and oppressive. This suspicion of, or hostility toward, mutual subjection is partly the fault of the Church too, which has often distorted the biblical meaning of the command. Throughout the 2 millennia of the history of Christianity, the Church has applied this command almost exclusively to those who occupy traditionally subordinate positions in society: children, wives, slaves, laborers, citizens, and ordinary church members, and has failed to apply it to those who hold traditionally dominant positions in society: fathers, husbands, masters, rulers, and church leaders. This imbalanced perspective has often made the subordinate group feel inferior, as if they belonged in a servile position and should therefore accept it as God's will. It has also made the dominant group feel invincible and arrogant, as if they had an absolute right to power and the freedom to use it as they wish. Most Christians, therefore, will not obey this command happily and willingly, if at all, without a reasonable explanation of what it means and does not mean. The Greek term provides the clarity we need. It combines 2 words, one that can be translated, quote, under, and the other, quote, order. To be subject to one another implies that we choose to order our lives under the circumstances, relationships, and roles in which we find ourselves. The 3 English words that are used to translate the Greek term subject, subordinate, and submit, which all begin with the same prefix sub, connote the same meaning as the Greek term. In essence, to be subject to one another implies that we acknowledge the necessity of social order, accept our place within it, and transform the social order through the power of radical obedience and sacrificial love. Obviously, the word itself assumes the reality of order, which God himself created for our own good. God established a certain kind of order, even in creation. What God created on the first day provided the proper setting for the second, and what God created on the second day set the stage for the third. And so it continued until the last day of creation, when God created living creatures, first animals, then human beings. The account in Genesis 1 reads like a symphony in 6 movements, describes the ordering of creation in a rhythmic way, and spells out the vast diversity and differentiation we see so plainly in the world around us, whether in nature or in society. God saw all that he had created, and he pronounced it good. Human beings add to this magnificent work by imposing their own kind of order on the world. We create works of art, launch new ventures, found institutions, build churches. We imitate God in these endeavors too. There is nothing inherently wrong with order. If anything, we could not live without it. I usually do several weddings every summer, and I often meet with couples ahead of time to get them ready for marriage. In the course of our premarital counseling sessions, we explore issues like family background, communication, conflict, expectations, and finances. I always ask them if they have discussed how they will establish division of labor in the home. What, I ask, will the husband do, the wife? They usually respond that they will do everything together: shopping, cleaning, cooking, and other details. Of course, it never ends up that way. Over time, the husband gravitates towards some chores and the wife to others. They discover that it is simply impossible, to say nothing of an inefficient, to do everything together. But the world has fallen too, which affects the social order in the same way it affects the natural order. The good order of society has become perverted and distorted. We see evidence of this everywhere. Marriages end in divorce because husbands and wives refuse to love and serve each other. Parents neglect or abuse their children, and children rebel against their parents. Employers use their position to advance their own interests, often at the expense of employees. Subordinates undermine the authority of their employers by complaining and performing poorly. Churches, of course, are no different. Pastors fail to execute their responsibilities faithfully. They play favorites and preach lousy sermons and get defensive and criticized. Meanwhile, parishioners expect to be entertained, refuse to volunteer for jobs that need to get done, and criticize without knowing all the facts. Institutions always suffer when people fail to fulfill the roles assigned to them and do the jobs expected of them. An article recently ran in Newsweek telling the story of a young man who brought a gun to school and shot and wounded several students and a teacher before he was apprehended. The article described the history of this troubled young man. As one teacher said, he kept, quote, slipping through the cracks. His mother was addicted to drugs. Her live-in boyfriend abused him. Classmates picked on him, and teachers always tried to pass him off to someone else. Every social institution that could have helped to reverse his downward spiral failed to do its job. He will spend years behind bars for his foolish action. As one teacher concluded, he was a victim of a system that, quote, does not work. The social order is a part of God's created order, both necessary and good. It is also perverse, fallen, and failing. That is true of every human institution, marriage and family, churches, businesses, sports, the arts, education, government. We can't live with these institutions, and we can't live without them. Mutual subjection is the biblical command that enables us to function in these fallen institutions without the spirit of resignation or rebellion. We accept our proper place in the social order, but we also strive to change the social order through the power of sacrificial love. Radical and relevant. The biblical texts that teach mutual subjection, especially Ephesians 5:21 to 6:10, seem excessively conservative to us now, embodying a view of reality that seems more fitting for ancient society than for ours. We fail to realize how radical this command really was in Paul's day, and, in fact, still is today. There are 4 features that set it apart as both radical and relevant. First, the command is addressed to everyone. Quote, "Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ." Addressed as it was to the entire church community, Paul's words would have shocked his ancient readers, for he was speaking both to master and to slave, to husband and to wife, to parents and to children. Paul requires that those who occupy dominant positions in the social order be subject to their subordinates. They are to order their lives under the very people over whom they exercise authority. Husbands are to be subject to their wives, fathers to their children, masters to their slaves, leaders to their followers, and pastors to their flocks. Paul also issues this command to the people who occupy subordinate positions in the social order, treating them as free moral agents. He commands them to be subject even though they already are subject, at least according to the social rules they occupy. Subjection is thus a choice. The command concerns more the position. It concerns how we function in that position. That we occupy a position of subordination is less important, according to Paul, than to what we do with it to glorify God. Second, how we obey this command depends on the particular position we occupy within the social order. There is differentiation based on the roles we have been assigned by God. Though the command is universal, the application is particular. Husbands are to love their wives as Christ loved the church, sacrificing their lives for them. Wives are to respect and honor their husbands. Fathers are to instruct and discipline their children. Children are to obey their parents. Masters are to be fair to their slaves. Slaves are to serve their masters from the heart. The greater responsibility, however, appears to be imposed on those who occupy dominant positions. Paul commands husbands, fathers, masters, leaders, and pastors to imitate Christ, who gave his life for sinners, though he had every right to assert power over them. When Jesus was describing the kind of leader he wanted his disciples to be, he proclaimed, quote, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave to all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Mark 10:42-45. Third, mutual subjection appears to correct the natural abuses that occur within the social order, though without abolishing the social order itself. Take, for example, the institution of the family. When addressing parents, Paul speaks only to fathers, not even bothering to mention mothers. Why the apparent oversight? It is probably because he didn't need to speak to mothers, for they usually fulfill their role naturally, because of biological predisposition and social expectation. But fathers are another matter altogether. What comes naturally to them is producing children, not rearing them, which explains why the vast majority of single parents are women, not men. Fathers tend to avoid domestic responsibilities. If they do remain in the home, they tend to neglect or abuse children, which, as Paul states, quote, "provokes them to anger." Fathers must therefore learn to function as good parents. Paul commands them to become active fathers, to train and discipline their children, and to help them grow up well. Paul commands children to obey their parents, quote, in the Lord. The root for the Greek word to obey is to, quote, listen and, quote, to hear. The kind of obedience Paul has in mind, in short, is not slavish, but thoughtful. Children should ask, what do my parents really have in mind? What is their intent? What is their primary concern? Wise children listen to their parents in that kind of reflective, careful way. Paul quotes the 5th commandment to support his injunction. It is the one commandment, he says, that is accompanied with a promise. If children obey their parents, the commandment reads, their days in the promised land will be long and prosperous. The quality of their adult life, in short, depends, at least in part, on the quality of their relationships with parents, especially when they were children. As a general rule, obedient children will do well in life, disobedient children will not, probably because obedient children are willing to learn life lessons from the very people, namely parents, who know them the best and who care for them the most. The skills, character, and convictions they need to do well in life are developed most easily and conveniently at home, even under difficult circumstances. If not, they will have to be developed later in life, often through painful experiences. In short, what happens in the home, however imperfect that home is, will play itself out in the rest of life. I was widowed many years ago. At the time of my wife's death, and my children were 8, 7, and 2 years old. They are all adults now, which means that for the majority of their years growing up, I was their only living parent, though their mother Linda did play an important role in absentia. At the time of their mother's death, I can say in good conscience that I was an active father, but I was also an ambitious professional who wanted to make a big splash in the world of higher education. I soon realized that those ambitions had to be subordinated to my duties as a single father. I discovered that I had to be subject to the needs of my children, especially considering how traumatized they were. Just last night, we celebrated my daughter's engagement. Her brothers were there, family friends, her fiancé's family. My daughter is a wonderful young woman, and she is marrying a good man. They are committed to serving Christ together. My sons have pledged themselves to live such a life too. The entire evening reminded me of the wisdom of my decision to try, however falteringly, to be subject to my children, making decisions and conducting my life as if they really do matter, which of course they do. This same principle of correction applies to husbands and wives. Men are naturally coercive, especially with women. Paul therefore commands husbands to love their wives, as Christ loved the church. And Peter reminds husbands that, in spite of the apparent inequality of men and women in the social order, they are, quote, joint heirs of the grace of God. There will be no hierarchy in heaven. Husbands are therefore to honor their wives and care for them, especially when they are vulnerable. If they fail to do this, Peter writes, their prayers will go unanswered, 1 Peter 3:7. But wives, who often hold subordinate positions in society, resort to other, subtler means to get their way, such as badgering and manipulating their husbands. So Peter enjoins wives to win their husbands to Christ through a gentle and quiet spirit, and he advises them to dress modestly, thus demonstrating that purity and goodness matter more than getting their way, 1 Peter 3:1-6. Mutual subjection requires all parties in the social order to hold their natural inclinations in check by striving to serve the best interests of others. Finally, all Christians are to be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ, or, quote, as to the Lord. Paul adds this qualification for 2 reasons. First, he wants to remind us that the Son of God himself became subject to us, sinners though we are, all for the sake of our salvation. Though he was, quote, in the form of God, he, quote, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Philippians 2:6-8. Second, he wants to assure us that Jesus Christ is now Lord over all. Therefore, God also highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bend, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Chapter 2, 9-11. Subjection puts our rights and privileges at risk, which, considering the values of modern society, might seem foolish. But our subjection is ultimately to Jesus Christ, not to a human being or a human institution. Jesus himself will act on our behalf, defend our rights, and accomplish his good purposes. As the story of Joseph keeps repeating, the Lord was, quote, with Joseph in the very circumstances that seemed to run contrary to everything we would naturally and rightly expect of God. Joseph practiced subjection. God used that subjection to advance his sovereign plan, and all ended well. Though others did great evil, God, quote, worked it out for good, at least in part because Joseph trusted God and chose to obey him. Jesus is Lord over all. We can therefore never use our circumstances, however undesirable, as an excuse not to be subject. A spirit of subjection demonstrates that we believe God is truly in control, even when he does not seem to be. God might choose in his providence to put us in difficult circumstances, for example, forcing us to work for an excessively demanding employer, or to pass through a challenging phase of parenthood, or to face a church feud, to purge us of pride and to prepare us for some greater purpose. I have observed this kind of situation time and time again. A woman endures a period of hardship in a particular job, only to find herself several years later in a position of responsibility for which that hardship prepared her. A pastor faces a problem at a church that over time ushers the church into a period of dramatic growth. A parent struggles to manage tumult at home, which years later leads to a ministry to distraught parents. If handled wisely, such challenges can set the stage for good work in the future. Subjection, therefore, requires us to trust in the sovereignty of God. If we insist on perfect people and circumstances before we become subject, then of course we will never learn subjection. We will be forever waiting for the world to be conformed to our wishes rather than allowing God to use the world, however imperfect, to conform to us to his wishes. The world, that is, our spouses, parents, co-workers, coaches, teachers, and bosses, need to change, of course. That goes without saying. But we need to change too. God will use the world as it is to make us more like Christ. Harmony is possible. It is possible to be subject even when we choose to disobey those in authority over us, provided we challenge their authority in a spirit of subjection, honoring the person and position, though not necessarily their policies. When Roman authorities ordered Peter and John to refrain from preaching the gospel, the two intrepid apostles refused, saying that they were obligated to obey God rather than human authorities. But they were willing to go to jail for it, too, thus upholding the social order even as they challenged it. Martin Luther King Jr. did something of the same thing when he practiced nonviolent resistance to challenge the injustice of segregation. As in the case of Peter and John, he went to jail, which reflected his dual commitment to justice and to the integrity of the social order. The validity of his protest was in fact heightened by his willingness to go to jail. Thus he disobeyed authority and honored authority at the same time. He chose to resist evil by doing good. Romans 12:12-17. Jesus provides the quintessential example here. Though he had every right, as the Son of God, to call on angels of heaven to punish the Jewish Sanhedrin and Roman government, he remained subject to both institutions, which resulted in his death and our salvation. On occasion, I have had an experience in institutions which I felt as if I were gliding across the dance floor as effortlessly as Sittser and Rogers. I worked for a number of years in an academic department that functioned harmoniously as I have ever seen. We enjoyed each other's company, celebrated each other's successes, and collaborated on various projects. But the harmony did not last forever. Eventually, problems surfaced and disrupted the harmony and damaged relationships. Our little club of intimate relationships had to be expanded to include others that did not fit so easily. We started to stumble across the dance floor, stepping on each other's feet, and sometimes out of frustration, kicking each other in the shin. We are still trying to resolve the problems. It is surprising, considering the fallenness of humanity, that harmony lasted as long as it did. I am confident the problems will be resolved. Mutual subjection will help solve them too, for subjection allows God to be in control and accomplish his perfect will through the very imperfect people and institutions, often in ways we never could have imagined. That's the end of chapter 3.